What if I told you that the FIA wants to change the rules right after having approved Ferrari's biggest innovation in years? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because yes, what seemed like a completely legal technical masterpiece could now disappear in 2027, and not because it was illegal, but because it was too effective. Ferrari has found an advantage that the rest cannot copy, and that has set off all the alarms within the paddock. The big question is inevitable. Are we facing a simple evolution of the regulations, or a direct attempt to stop Ferrari before it dominates Formula One? It all starts with a strange feeling in the paddock, one of those that does not appear out of nowhere, but rather builds little by little until it explodes. Ferrari had not only taken a step forward, it had found something different, something that did not fit with the natural evolution of the rest of the teams. While some were still understanding their own cars, in Maranello, they had already unlocked a solution that completely changed the way of interpreting the rear of the car, and the most disturbing thing of all is that they did it within the limits of the regulations. The center of this whole story is the so-called flick tail mode, a system that on the surface could go unnoticed by the less trained eye, but which in reality represents one of the most intelligent and aggressive interpretations of the technical regulations in recent years. Ferrari didn't just look for downforce like everyone else. It went further, understanding that exhaust gases could become an active tool to manipulate airflow in critical areas of the car. And that's the key to everything. It's not just an improvement, it's a new way of generating performance. What this system does is redirect the hot gases towards the top, creating an effect that simultaneously improves the diffuser and the rear spoiler. This generates stability and efficiency that translates directly into lap time, but what is really important is not only the benefit, but how it is achieved. Ferrari designed its car from the ground up with this concept in mind, modifying structural elements such as the gearbox to be able to fully exploit this solution. It's not a patch, it's not an update, it's a complete design philosophy. And this is where the rest of the paddock begins to react. Because when rival engineers saw the SF-26 on the track, they immediately understood that they were not looking at just another innovation. The advantage was tangible, measurable, and above all worrying. They began to talk about gains of several tenths per lap, an enormous difference in a category where every thousandth counts. Some teams tried to replicate it, presenting their own versions of the concept, but most ran into a glaring problem. They didn't have the architecture to make it work properly. And then comes the most delicate point of this whole act. The FIA had already approved this system. Ferrari was not playing on the edge of illegality. It was not hiding anything. It had passed the reviews, had been validated, and was therefore completely legal. But the more obvious the advantage became, the more uncomfortable the situation became. Because in Formula One, when an innovation breaks the balance, history has taught us that it is rarely allowed to evolve freely. This is how the real conflict begins to take shape. It is not just a technical question, it is political, it is strategic, it is even philosophical. Should the FIA allow a brilliant interpretation of the regulations to mark an era? Or should it intervene to maintain competitive equality? Ferrari, without saying it openly, has already made its position clear. They have done their job better than anyone else. But now the question is no longer up to them. It's up to who writes the rules. The reaction was not immediate, but when it came, it was overwhelming. Because as soon as the data began to confirm it on the track, the paddock understood that Ferrari had not only found performance, it had found a structural advantage that could mark an era. And that's where everything changes. It's no longer about technical admiration, it's about real concern. The engineers of the rival teams began to analyze the system in depth, trying to replicate it against clock, but they ran into a wall. It was not a part, it was not an adjustment, it was a concept integrated from the DNA of the car. Teams like Mercedes, Red Bull, or McLaren were quick to present their own interpretations of the blown exhaust, trying to capture a part of that benefit. But the difference was evident. While Ferrari had designed its entire car around the FTM, the rest were trying to adapt it to existing structures, which greatly limited its effectiveness. It was like trying to copy a work of architecture without changing the foundation of the building. And in Formula One, that simply doesn't work. This is where the real pressure begins. Because when 6 different teams come up with similar solutions in a matter of weeks, it's no coincidence. It's a clear sign that something big is at stake. The paddock goes into alert mode. Internal meetings intensify, analyses multiply, and above all, conversations that are never made public begin, those that occur far from the cameras, where teams begin to question whether this advantage should continue to be legal. And then the determining factor appears, the FIA. What was initially a technical approval without much noise is beginning to become an internal case study, because the magnitude of the FTM's impact can no longer be ignored. We are not talking about a marginal improvement, we're talking about several tenths per lap, a difference that in practice redefines the competitive order. And when that happens, the FIA enters delicate territory, protecting innovation or protecting equality. But what makes this situation even more tense is the obvious contradiction. The FIA approved the system. Ferrari invested time, resources, and development based on that validation. And now, with the performance already demonstrated, its ban is beginning to be considered for 2027. This change in position not only generates doubts, it generates distrust, because it sends a very clear message to the rest of the teams. Even if you do everything within the rules, there are no guarantees that you can maintain your advantage. Meanwhile, Ferrari watches. They don't react publicly, but internally they know what's going on. They have struck first, they have struck hard, and now they are in the spotlight. Because in Formula One, dominating too quickly usually has consequences. And history has already shown that when an innovation breaks the balance, the system tends to correct itself. The tension is already on the table. The teams press, the FIA evaluates, and Ferrari waits. But the big question continues to grow, stronger and stronger. Is this a natural evolution of the regulations, or the beginning of a direct battle against Ferrari? And then we reach the critical point, because everything that was brewing in silence begins to take real shape. The FIA is no longer just evaluating Ferrari's system, is seriously considering eliminating it from the regulations starting in 2027. And this is where this story stops being technical and becomes a direct conflict that can change the future of Formula One. The key to this act is understanding the impact of that possible decision. If the FIA decides to ban FTM, it will not only be eliminating a specific innovation, it will be invalidating years of Ferrari's strategic development. Because this system is not something isolated that can be removed without consequences. It is integrated into the architecture of the car, into the design philosophy, into the way Ferrari has decided to build its competitive advantage. Removing this is not adjusting, is forcing you to start over. And here appears the true dilemma that defines this moment. The FIA has to choose between two completely opposite paths. On the one hand, allowing Ferrari to exploit its innovation and possibly dominate a new regulatory era. On the other hand, intervene to prevent this advantage from breaking the competitive balance. But either decision has a cost. If they do not act, the championship could tilt too soon towards a single team. If they act, a dangerous message is sent. Innovating too well can backfire. Meanwhile, the rest of the teams watch carefully, but also with interest. Because although publicly they may appear neutral, internally they know that a ban would directly benefit them. Many of them cannot replicate the system without completely redesigning their cars, something unfeasible in the short term. So the pressure, although not always visible, exists. And in Formula One, that pressure often ends up influencing more than it seems. Ferrari, for its part, finds itself in an uncomfortable but powerful position at the same time. They have shown that they can anticipate the regulations, that they can interpret the gray areas better than anyone. But now they depend on an external decision that could erase that advantage. And that's what makes this story much bigger than just a technical innovation. It is a battle between creativity and intervention, between freedom and control. Because if this ban is confirmed, it will not only change the future of Ferrari, it will change the mentality of the entire grid. Teams will stop asking themselves, how far can we innovate? And they will begin to ask themselves, what will they let us keep? And that change in mentality may be even more important than any tenth per lap. So everything remains up in the air, a decision that is not yet official, but that is already generating consequences. Ferrari has the advantage, the FIA has the power, and the rest of the teams are waiting for the result. In the end, it all comes down to a single idea that perfectly summarizes what is happening. Ferrari did exactly what Formula One says it wants: innovate, take risks, and find advantages within the regulations. But now that that advantage is too great, the system seems ready to react. Because we are not simply talking about a possible technical ban, we are talking about a precedent that can mark the future of the sport. If the FIA decides to eliminate FTM in 2027, the message will be clear to all teams. It is not enough to be within the rules. You also have to make sure you do not go too far. And that completely changes the competitive essence of Formula One. Ferrari has shown that it is still capable of getting ahead of the rest, of interpreting the gray areas of the regulations better than anyone, of building a real advantage when it was needed most. But right now that advantage is in the air, pending a decision that does not depend on the stopwatch, nor on the engineers, nor on the pilots, but on the dispatches. And this is where the great final reflection that I leave you comes in. Do we want a Formula One where innovation makes the differences, or one where those differences are limited when someone does it too well? Because what is happening with Ferrari today, tomorrow could happen with any other team. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.